Hello and welcome to Varn Blog Solo. And today I'm going to make the case for selectively vulgar Marxism. This one goes out to Keith, who has been pressuring me to talk about this more explicitly for a while. While often I'm asked to trace small marginal figures' money privately, I don't ever talk about it in public because, frankly, this is an area where it's easy to be sued. Ask yourself a question. Can you explain the blind spot of some pundit, some thinker, some theorist in relationship to how they get their funding? After all, the material reproduction of society is based on the social reproduction of individuals on a fairly large scale. So there's a lot of incentive to compromise principle. And I wanted to invoke an Engel's quote for this because I think it's actually quite useful. This leads us to a longish quote from the introduction of the Civil War in France, which was written on the 20th anniversary of the Paris Commune. And I'll read it because it's relevant here, and then I'll come back to my point. From the very outset, the Commune was compelled to recognize that the working class, once come to power, would not go on managing the old state machine. That in order to lose again its just conquered supremacy, the working class must, on one hand, do away with all the old representative machinery previously against itself, and on the other, safeguard itself against its own deputies and officials by declaring them all, without exception, subject to recall at any moment. What have been characteristic attributes of the formal state? Society had created its own organs to look after its common interest, originally through simple division of labor. But these organs, at whose head was state power, had, in the course of time, in pursuance with their own special interest, transformed themselves from servants of society into masters of society. This can be seen, for example, not only in hereditary monarchy, but equally so in the democratic republic. Nowhere do politicians form a more separate and powerful section of the nation than precisely in North America. There, each of the two major parties, which alternately succeed each other in power, is itself in turn controlled by the people who make the business of politics, who speculate on seats in the legislative assemblies of the Union, as well as of the separate states, and who make a living by carrying out agitation for their party, and on its victory are rewarded with positions. It is well known how Americans have been trying for 30 years to shake off this yoke, which has become intolerable over 150 years ago, roughly. And how, in spite of it, all they continue to sink deeper and deeper in the swamp of corruption. It is precisely in America that we see best how there takes place this process of state power making itself independent in relation to society, whose mere instrument it was originally intended to be. Here, there exists no dynasty, no nobility, no standing army. Asterisk, not true anymore. There's a standing army after the Civil War, but there wasn't early on. Beyond a few men keeping watch on the Indians, no bureaucracy without the permanent post or right to petitions. And nevertheless, we find here the two great gangs of political speculators who alternately take possession of the state and exploit it for the most corrupt means and for the most corrupt ends. And the nation is powerless against these two great cartels of politicians who are ostensibly its servants, but in reality dominate and plunder it. And against this transformation of the state and the organs of the state from the servants of society into masters of society, an invisible transformation in all previous states, the Commune made use of two infallible means. In the first place, it filled all posts, administrative, judicial, and educational, by election on the basis of universal suffrage of all concerned, subject to the right of recall at any time by the same electors, and in the same place, all officials, high or low, were paid only in wages received by the workers. The highest salary paid by the Commune to anyone was 6,000 francs. In this way, an effective barrier to place hunting and careerism was set up, even apart from the binding mandates on delegates to represent bodies, which were added besides. The shattering of the former state power and its replacement by a new and truly democratic one is described in detail in the third section of the Civil War. But it was necessary to dwell briefly here once more on some of these features, because in Germany, particularly, the superstitious belief that the state has been carried over from philosophy into the general consciousness of the bourgeoisie and many of the workers. According to the philosophical conception, the state is a realization of an idea, or a kingdom of God on earth. Translated into philosophical terms, it was the sphere in which eternal truth and justice is or should be realized. This is a critique of Hegel, by the way, if you can't catch that. It's also a critique of America. And from this follows the superstitious reverence for the state and everything connected with it. Cough, cough, socialist today, cough, cough. Which takes root the more readily since people are accustomed from childhood to imagine the affairs and interests common to the whole society, which would not be looked after otherwise, then they can be looked after in the past, that is, through the state and its lucratively positioned officials. And people think they have taken quite an extraordinary bold step when they have gotten rid of the belief in hereditary monarchy and swear by the democratic republic. In reality, however, the state is nothing but the machine of oppression of one class by another. And indeed, in the democratic republic, no less than the monarchy, and best evil inherited by the proletariat after its victorious struggle for class supremacy, whose worst sides the victorious proletariat, just like the commune, cannot avoid having to lop off at once as much as possible until the time that a generation reared in a new free social conditions is able to throw the entire lumber of the state into the scrap heap. Of late, the social democratic Philistine has once more been filled with the wholesome terror at the words dictatorship of the proletariat. Well and good, gentlemen. Do you want to know what the dictatorship of the proletariat looks like? Look at the Paris Commune. That was a dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, there's lots to pull out from that long selection from the Civil War in France. But the question that I want you to be thinking about is the fine grain of class influence and class power. We have already talked about how capital ownership is increasingly structuralized, removed from any face of the individual entrepreneur. Even often the heads and entrepreneurs themselves are hidden by layers of bureaucracy which act as intermediaries between them and the rest of society and also their business, even to the point of forcing otherwise things that would be irrational under normally productive capitalist conditions, nonetheless, in a closed system, become rational for immediate profits, even at the term and cost of productivity. But this is obvious to even most people who have no love of socialism. Hating on politicians is universal because it's easy to see how they are corrupt. And yet, almost as Althusser talks about interpolation, the system works partly by realization of the general idea of corruption being ubiquitously accepted as a standard. Once we reject this, we can look at where people's money comes from. What will their structural limitations be and why? People rarely endanger their social reproduction, which is why, for example, people who do politics as a job, either as punditry or as a politician, are in some non-governmental organization, aka a rent-seeking operation for the general good. We can see very clearly that we often learn the limits of what people can talk about based on who is paying their bills. Even when they do not corruptly endorse such things, there's many things of which they will not look. Are all of a sudden their peer groups, which are often paid for by the same people, talk the same talking points. This does not mean you should throw this all out as propaganda. After all, your enemies often have plenty of reason to tell you the truth. The purveyors of empire often are after you the most when they are telling you the truth, as are your general enemies. Furthermore, Sometimes in the course of history, things like protest over national events will uncover other things that were never deeply intended and even endanger the class position of those pushing for reforms. But when it comes to pundits, one does not need to be a conspiracy theorist to realize that the source of the money explains a lot, and where that money goes and who is dependent on it. It is good to understand classes, but it is sometimes better to understand this at a fine-grained level. Yes, people are traders of their position. Yes, people will betray their patrons. People have enough agency to do that, but they are not likely to, which is the exception that proves the rule more often than not. People rarely bite the hand that feeds, but gifts, as Claude Lévi-Strauss said long ago, often make slaves. As you interpret the bias of any particular speaker, ask people how they make their money. I'm a public school teacher. There are certain things involved with public school teaching, I will be quite honest, that I do not talk about, because they would risk my job and would have legal repercussions. It is not because there's a grand conspiracy there. There is not. Nor would I hesitate to comment on very broad and general principles of public education, which I do. And the current state of public education, or of education even outside of the public education, is often abysmal. The failure of the reform movement of the 90s and aughts has led to be replaced with nothing but inertia and decay. People do not like to hear this because they would like to believe that there should be, I don't know, very little accountability for teachers, etc., etc., etc. As a teacher, I can tell you, I neither like the accountability regimes nor trust the demand to remove them. But that is just one example. What is the wall on which you hit? Many political organizations, when they don't become NGOs and become captive to NGO boards and markets, try to get independent patrons without realizing that they're now even more directly captive to the patron. I have been this, actually. I have worked for left-wing publications that had secret funders. And we accidentally ended up at war with one funder versus fighting another and squandering the publication until we handed it back to its original funder. Follow the money. To understand power relationships, you have to understand both wealth and the transfers of money. And I don't just mean in a superficial, oh, someone gets money from Sue or somebody's associated with this think tank and they're, it's got to be deeper than that. Follow the money in a deep and complex way. Don't ask people to do it for you. Do it for yourself. Learn to check public records when you can. A lot of things are actually not even hidden. People just don't easily know how to look. Follow the money. And remember, if people make their living by giving you punditry, there is a counter incentive to be successful because their success would chase them out of a job. And unless they really see a total social change of revolution on the horizon in a real way, there is often not a whole lot for them to hope for other than the maintenance. This is why even a reactionary like Pat Buchanan can say, And I think we need to take this as truth. Political movements that fail to manifest turn into businesses and die as grifts. And there's a lot of blurred lines in between. Follow everybody's money, not just your enemies, but also your allies. Take care, like and subscribe, hit the bell, and keep thinking about the flows of power hidden in financial relations.